one of the things I want to talk a little bit about today, and I want to remind us of the overall themes of Samuel. And when you take a look at the book of Samuel, there are 3 or 4 themes that are really essential and flow all the way through both 1st and 2nd Samuel. I think number 1, God is exercising his kingship. And one of the ways he does it is to inaugurate a Davidic dynasty in Israel. And if you take a look at the kings of Israel, everyone goes back to the king that accomplished the most and was the best king, and that's King David. He's also assigning Solomon to build the temple. And that's an important part of what we'll cover mainly in 2nd Samuel. And that temple is going to be where? Where is that temple? Jerusalem. And that's the central location, the only location where people can make sacrifices. So I think that's an important theme. Additionally, of course, he introduces the whole concept of monarchy. What ruled Jerusalem before that? Before the monarchy? Judges, okay? And who was the last judge? Samuel was the last judge. And Samuel anointed Saul, but Samuel also anointed David. And then finally, all through all of this, we see not only God's kingship, but we see his providential guidance and we see his sovereignty. And that comes through over and over and over again. So those are central themes, and it's important to kind of keep those in mind. Now, when we ended the last time, which was, I don't know, 10 weeks ago or something like that, it seems like it. Anyway, Samuel had bid farewell and he ceased to be a judge. So he was no longer a judge. Saul built an army and the Philistines were assembling. So Saul built an army, and then Saul made his big mistake and he suffered for it. Now, what was Saul's big mistake? There were a couple of them. Well, he tried to be a priest and he gave a sacrifice because he didn't wait for Samuel. But what else did he do?
He disobeyed when he was told to go and wipe out all the Amalekites, and he decided he could do something.
He didn't do it. He kept the king around and kept some of the best. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so Samuel had to come and slay the king and really rebuked. Now that was his first mistake, but God didn't take his spirit away from him then, but he did later on when he decided he was going to be a priest. So today I want to look at Jonathan. Saul wasn't leading, okay, but Jonathan did lead. I want to take a look at him leading and the Philistines being defeated. Now, Glenn, can you read 1 Samuel 13? Jack, by the way, is not here today. So we've got a willing substitute. So where's Glenn at? Glenn, are you here?
I'm hiding over here.
Oh, yeah. Well, don't worry about mispronouncing words, but go ahead.
I cheated. I kind of looked. There's nothing in here. I think it's going to cause me too much trouble. So
That's good. Okay. So 1 Samuel 13,
Verses
19, 20.
Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all of Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, sickles sharpened. That's it.
So let me just ask a question now, because they had to go down to the Philistines, kind of have all of their tools, anything they wanted sharpened. They didn't have access to blacksmiths, so they had to force them to go down to the Philistines, and the Philistines liked it that way. But how many of you are car people? Okay, you like cars. Okay, so you like cars. Okay, well, you know what's interesting? That's only 3 or 4 of you. That surprises me. Yeah. He didn't raise his hand. Okay, raise your hand. How many people like cars or car buffs? Okay, all right. See, hold him accountable, Terry. Well, when I didn't like cars that much because mostly I couldn't afford them. At one point, I had 3 cars. And I didn't spend over $100 for any of them. And when my cars broke down, I knew God. Hello? Who's that? Someone talking? Come in, Amelia. So I had a guy in our neighborhood. Uh-oh. We got some double speak here.
You're good.
Okay, so we had a guy in our neighborhood who fixed cars for a few dollars. And actually, he was a southern guy living in a northern city, which is interesting. But when my cars died, which was pretty frequently, I'd take the plates off and I just leave it in the street because the city would eventually come and tow it away. Because I didn't have a lot of money invested, I just leave them there. And one vehicle that I had that I really liked was a 1954 Chevy truck. The Chevy truck was missing, and this is what a 1954 Chevy. Does that look good? That's a nice. My truck didn't look like that. It was missing third gear, and it was really a beauty. But in Illinois, they have what's called a recreational vehicle license. Well, the recreational vehicle license is half the cost of a regular license. So the person I bought it from, and I didn't do this, honestly, I promise, had built with some plywood, really a covered, kind of shell on the back, and got away with getting a recreational vehicle license. So I drove that thing around with the plywood, stick it up and the head over it, and we drove it all over the place. As a matter of fact, I still had that truck. Remember that truck, Gigi? Yeah, when we were married. And do you remember Sanford and Son? Okay. Well, I had a friend of mine named Jim Schlecker, who I taught with, put a sign on the truck, and he put, instead of Sanford and Son, he put Moisten and Wife, dealers in old gym shoes. I remember one night we had a wind chill factor of 70 below zero. And that's what happens in Chicago. And Old Red, this truck was the only thing that started. Imagine that. I remember Gigi made me come in the house because it was so cold. But imagine if I only had one place to get those vehicles fixed. And not only that, imagine that process of fixing them was controlled. And not only that, but they gouged us with prices, and it was controlled by the government. And they continued to price gouge. Now think about that. That's exactly what Israel faced. And they were really close to being defenseless. Why is that? Yeah. They were disarmed. They couldn't have weapons. If they brought their weapons down there to be sharpened, what happens? They confiscate those weapons, right? And by the way, does that sound familiar? Yeah. But anyway, that's another story. So there were really no blacksmiths at all in Israel. So they had to rely on the Philistines to sharpen their tools. So they're captives. And the Philistines are technologically superior to Israel. And what's more, they wanted to keep it that way. They wanted them to be technologically inferior. And Israel was dependent on the Philistines. And it really sounds like big government. And that's why I think you've got taxation issues, you've got gun control issues, you've got other ideologies, and those are essential to big government. So right here, and that's all the political statement I'll make, but right here, it's clear that the Israelites are undermanned and technologically inferior. Now, the only way they'd win is through faith in God's intervention. And I think that's the point here. They had to trust God. They had to put their faith in God. They had to follow God. So essentially, here's where they are. And George Mueller said this, and I think this is important. The beginning of anxiety is the end of faith, and the beginning of true faith is the end of anxiety. Now, to learn strong faith is to endure great trials, And he said, I have learned my faith by standing firm amid severe testing. Now, what do you know about George Mueller? What does anybody know about George Mueller? Yeah, Terry.
Well, he ran an orphanage in Germany and never asked anybody to help. He always prayed. You know, the son's good stories of not having food for the children that morning. And he prayed to God food, and the baking truck would be supposed to break down out near the orphanage and give them all of their baked goods. And there were just things like that that happened with him all the time. He had such great faith in God and strong prayer.
And he prayed on a regular basis. There's story after story after story about George Mueller praying resources into his orphanages. And he had more than one orphanage. He had several orphanages. But he prayed. And essentially, to do anything, this is my opinion, but to do anything significant in the Lord requires that we trust God through faith. Let me repeat that. To do anything significant in the Lord requires that we trust God through faith. Do you believe that?
Yes.
And I think the more we trust him, and this is important, the more we trust him, the more he does. And God actually spells that out in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Glenn, can you read that?
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight.
So in the first three verses, we see Saul, we see Jonathan, we see his armor bearer, and we see Saul's 600 men in 1 Samuel 14, 1 through 3.
One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left.
Does anybody in here know what an armor bearer is? You know what an armor bearer? What's an armor bearer? Well, primarily officers. All officers had sidekicks or servants, and they're called armor bearers. And they help them actually in lots of different ways, but particularly in battle. And they often carried their weapons and they often carried their armors, like a caddy with heavy weapons, though. And officers really depended on them and sometimes depended on them for their lives. And they had to have a servant's heart. Can you read Philippians 2, 5 through 9?
Yes. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name.
So take a look at this. Here is Jesus, the king, coming to earth, humbling himself, and essentially humbling himself in a way where he actually becomes our armor bearer, doesn't he? He becomes our armor bearer. See, the three responsibilities were to provide strength and support of the king. And secondly, to respect and be loyal to the king. And thirdly, really to gain and operate with the mind of the king. And this quote here is from the armor bearer checklist. And it says, armor bearing in the attitude of service is not just the performing of humble tasks, but is an effort to serve Christ in the kingdom of God. Jesus said, the servant of all is the greatest of all. So Jesus served us all, and of course, he is the greatest. Now, let me just ask you this question, because it's an important question I want you to think about. We are in a battle, and Christ is our king. So how do we serve him better in life? What is it that we can do to serve God better, to serve Christ better? Huh? Alvin? Okay, so we serve others as if they're Christ himself. What else? Okay. Go ahead. Talk about the Great Commission. Where'd you hear that at? Good. I wish Elizabeth Elliott wouldn't have said that. Because I'm reminded every time I'm praying for God to lead me, direct me, to help me find what he wants me to do, I keep remembering that I'm supposed to do what's in front of me on a regular basis and do it well, do it as unto the Lord. But that's how we serve him. That's how we become armor bearers. So Jonathan leads here, but he's assisted by his armor bearer. Now look at this. Here's Saul in the meantime. And where is Saul at? He's sitting under a pomegranate tree. He's overwhelmed, he's deserted, and he's about to be defeated. And notice his company. He's sitting there with Ahijah. Okay, Ahijah is Ichabod's nephew. Now you remember Ichabod, don't you? Who is Ichabod? Who was Ichabod's father? No, Phineas. Phineas was his father. Eli was his grandfather. Phineas was his father. And tell me about Phineas. Phineas was killed. His mother gave birth to Ichabod right as she is finding out that Phineas is dead. She died in childbirth. And what does Ichabod mean? Ichabod, what's that mean? You know, remember? The glory of the Lord is departed. So doesn't it fit here? I mean, here's Saul sitting on a tree. Now, meanwhile, okay, let's switch over to Jonathan. So Saul is sitting on a tree, not leading. Would you agree? He's not doing anything.
Not only that, but his lack of faith was infectious because many 600 warriors who were with him were slowly leaving.
And they departed. We're going to talk about that next week. But meanwhile, Jonathan and his armor bearer take on the Philistines independently. Now, this is very interesting because you can see Jonathan gives his armor bearer really the plan. And so what he says is, it sounds a little bit crazy, doesn't it? Crawl up there. We're going to crawl up there between two rocky cliffs to get up to the top. Now, can you imagine the conversation? Okay. Let's you and I go up there and get those 20 Philistines. Okay. And the armor bearer tells him what? Are you crazy?
Wherever you go, I will go with you.
Yeah. Do what you, the armor bearer says, do what you think is best. 1 Samuel 14, 6 and 7.
Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Do all that you want, do all that you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul."
Now, so he's basically telling him he's all in. Okay, go ahead. I'll follow you. I'll be there. What's interesting here is that God chose Jonathan for this, didn't he? But I believe he also chose the armor bearer. Now, see, what's interesting about that is I think God trusted them. And God could display his power through them. And he knew that they bring glory to God and not themselves. See, I think sometimes God doesn't bless us because he's afraid of what's going to happen. You know, he's not certain that we're going to give glory to him. As a matter of fact, he might do more damage than good. Did you ever think about that? God, why haven't you done this with me? Why haven't you led me? Why haven't you blessed me this way? Well, I think it's because in part he can't trust us. See, God does things through people he trusts. That makes sense? But this is kind of crazy. I mean, listen to the next verses. They're crazy unless they're based on faith. 1 Samuel 14, 8 through 10.
Jonathan said, "This comes in, and we'll cross over towards the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait here until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands."
So look at Jonathan's faith here. As he's looking for a sign from the Lord, and he says, if they say something specific, he'll know. And he says, "For the Lord has delivered them into our hand, and this will be a sign to us." Now, do you think the armor bearer was questioning? Are you sure? I mean, there are 20 of them or 2 of us. Do you think he was questioning at all? Huh? Didn't seem like it at all. You know, I had a friend of mine, and he liked to fight. And any of you have friends like that? His name, yeah, Bobby had a few friends like that. Anyway, his name was Dan Keenan, and some of you have met Dan. He and his wife Therese were here, but we were at a dance one night, for example, and this is just one of many examples. And there's a big fight that breaks out with the band, okay? And I immediately turned to my buddy Sims. It was Sims, Keenan, and me who hung out together. I turned to Sims, and Sims is huge. He's about 6'6", and he weighs about 260. Played defensive end for Purdue. And I said to Sims, I said, "Where's Keenan?" He looked at me and said, "I don't know, but he's probably over there." Sure enough, he was in the middle of a fight. He loved to fight, and he was always dragging me in with him. And I didn't like to fight, but he dragged me in with him. So, but this is a little bit different atmosphere. Why? Why? What's the difference between? I'm sorry, Dan. What's the difference between Dan? And by the way, I led Dan Keenan to Christ before he died, which is really cool. He got shot up in Vietnam and came back with lots of problems, and ultimately he died of cirrhosis of the liver. But what's the difference between Jonathan and my buddy Dan Keenan?
Well, Dan was trusting in himself, but
And yeah, and hopefully me and Sims, but that's another story.
Jonathan was waiting on if the Lord showed him that he was gonna take care of it, he just went in faith and trusted the Lord.
See, so you can do things that seem unconventional, but if you're trusting in God, now that doesn't mean that God calls you to be stupid. But if you're trusting in God and God has his hand on you, he can do miraculous things. See, the problem is, I don't think we trust God. See, here we go. In contrast to Saul, and he sat frozen, I think, in fear, Jonathan sets out trusting God in faith. And Jonathan didn't have all the answers, did he? He didn't exactly know what he was going to do, but he knew what he was called to do. So let me ask you, how many of us, when God calls us to do something, how many of us shrink back from calling? Because we don't have all the answers. And sometimes we wind up cutting and running when we meet resistance. Do you think that's pretty common? Well, think about this. I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul. And he wrote to the Corinthians about his plans to visit them. And he said, if the Lord permitted him, what was he going to do? He'd spend some extra time with them. However, first, he was going to stay in Ephesus. He was going to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. Why? Because, as he said, a great door for effective work had opened for him. Now, if we're reading the signs, what might be a great door being opened for us if we're reading the signs? Tell me what you think a great door of maybe opportunity open for you.
I believe today more people are opening up because of their fears and their concerns about the future of this country, the world in general. And I don't know, I've had lots of opportunities with people that aren't believers to talk about the Lord. And
So they're open to it. Okay. What else might be a great door of opportunity?
Well, I was divorced, was never going to get married again, never, ever. Met this man, and I remember walking up my steps, as he had asked me to marry him. And I said, Lord, is this really what you want? And it was a definite yes. And I thought he was this wonderful Christian man, and that God was giving him to me as a gift for all the pain I had suffered. But instead, he was a carnal Christian, and God wanted me to bring him to know him.
Okay. Any other confessions? I'm Father Len today. Any other? Done.
Father,
Father.
you know, I think it's human nature. I think even with Christians, that you don't often seek the Lord or pray until you're in real trouble. And I think that's how society in the whole is. They don't really look for the Lord or spiritual things until things are bad. And that's the way we're heading in the world these days. So I think there are wonderful opportunities everywhere to talk about that.
Well, you know, what's interesting about that, John, is that David tells us, in the morning, I make my requests. And then what does he say after that? I wait not just wait, but I wait how? In anticipation or in expectation, okay? So how often do we lay our requests before the Lord and then look to him all day for him to deliver on that? I mean, how many times do we just lay our requests out there and then we walk away? But David said, in the morning I make my request and then I wait in expectation. What's this, pop quiz? No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But there's a little thing called Google that you could just put that in there, and it'll come up. In the morning, I make my request and then I wait in expectations. Huh?
I'm pretty sure it's Sam05.
Good, Gigi. Thanks for bailing me out. But what's interesting here is look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 16, 8, 9.
But I will stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost, because a great door for effective work has opened to me, and there are many who oppose me.
So that's his great door. Okay, think about that. That's his great door. There are many who oppose me. Paul wrote to the Corinthians about his opportunity in Ephesus. And his idea of an opportunity is people opposing him. And not only were they opposing him, a riot breaks out. Why? Because he was healing and casting out demons in the name of Jesus, and he was upsetting their business. Acts 19, 23 through 29, Glenn.
About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. He called them together along with the workmen in related trades and said, men, you know that we receive good income from this, business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus, and the practicality of the whole province, and practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. There is a danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia, the world will be robbed of her divine majesty. When they heard of this, they were furious and began shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and rushed as one man into the theater.
All right, so here you go. Paul is healing people in the name of Jesus. Okay. And these guys are thinking, this is bad for business, right? I mean, many of them are merchants and silver merchants. And so why is that important? Well, they're making silver idols, okay, to Artemis. And so they start a riot and they start to spread false news. That's up from there. And essentially people buy into it and jump on board, and they drag them into the stadium. They're in the middle of the stadium going crazy, and Paul wants to go in the middle and talk to them. You know, but there are many who oppose me, and that's his equivalent of a great opportunity. A riot breaks out, and that's a great opportunity, right? Now, usually when a riot broke out, it was time to, kind of hit the road, but Paul wanted to go in the middle of it. Huh? Well, yeah, but he wasn't Paul. By any stretch of the imagination, and he didn't have a redeeming message for people. But that's a long story. And I think when you take a look at this, the same thing is true with Jonathan, isn't it? And also his armor bearer. And they proceed to take on the Philistines, and the odds are 10-1. Yeah, Gigi.
I think that's probably why Jonathan each other so much, because they had that same kind of spirit, trusting God and just going against the odds.
Yeah. What do you say? What do you say about Goliath? Do you remember what he said?
Sword and whatever, and I come to you in the name of the Lord. I come to you in the name of the God of Israel. And he knew that there was a whole lot more on his side than there was on the lion's side.
Well, he knew it, but not everybody else knew it. Everybody else thought he's going to get clobbered.
Translation that says, when Jonathan said, God is not constrained to win by many or few.
God could do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And again, that deals with the sovereignty of God, that theme that runs through this 1 and 2 Samuel. The odds are 10-1. They go in there, and look what happens. 1 Samuel 14:11-14. Glenn.
So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philippines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes.
All right. Now, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. What's that about? What's that about? The Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Well, yeah, but the Hebrews actually were in holes. They were hiding from the Philistines. So there was truth here. Go ahead.
The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to help us and we'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about a half an acre.
Now, more than likely, the Philistines thought they were coming to surrender. Because essentially, in chapter 13, you see the Israelites running and hiding. And they were hiding from the Philistines. So they thought they were coming to surrender. And really, what's interesting here is that I think Jonathan's faith superseded his fear. His faith superseded his fear. See, oftentimes, what I said before is that fear leads to tyranny, faith leads to freedom. And Jonathan was free to attack these Philistines based on his faith. And you see, oftentimes our fear keeps us from achieving what God wants us to achieve in God's name and for the glory of God and for the advancement of his kingdom. Fears hold us back. I don't really want to talk to that person. They won't receive me well. I don't really want to say this. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't do this. I just want peace in my family, so I'm not going to talk about religion. And essentially, a lot of those things keep us back and hold us back from achieving what God wants us to, and it's because of fear. Now, the climb is difficult, and they're on their knees. So imagine this, and there are sharp rocks on both sides, and they even had names for the rocks, Bozez and Seneh. And Bozez means sharp, shiny, brighter than white, okay? And Seneh means sharp and thorny. So here's Jonathan climbing up a bright, narrow, thorny ravine lined with sharp rock. It's not an easy climb. And yet he's going forward and his armor bearer is right with him. Yeah.
Hold the sword when you're climbing up something so steep that you're having to use your feet anchor.
Then in verse 15, God attacks the Philistines. Notice I said, not Jonathan, God attacks the Philistines. He causes trembling in their camp, and they're confused. How many times has God done that? caused trembling in their camp and confusion. I mean, he still does that today. I'll get to that in a minute, but God sent an earthquake and really that further shaped them and they began fighting each other. Okay. And Jonathan bravely showed up for battle, but he didn't have to battle too much. God did it for him. And he did something for Jonathan, what he couldn't really do for himself. And what's interesting about that, he'll do the same thing for us. He'll do the same kind of miraculous work for us if we show up in faith. How many of you have ever taken on a task that God gave to you, that God led you to do? And you were afraid to do it, but you went ahead and do it and did it. And God bless you, Bobby.
Florida, lay leader had asked me to do a 5-minute lay talk to the congregation. And I actually prayed about it and I had about 2 months preparation. And I reviewed it with Sue and she said, if you say that, I'm not going. and then I did a John 3 talk about being born again in a church that never really talked about the gospel. And I called the senior pastor the night before, and I said, here's what I want to do. I want to move the benches up close to the front of the church so people can come up and pray. He says, I wouldn't do that if I was you. He said, people don't like to hear that kind of message here.
And so you took his advice, right?
No. Actually, after I gave the message and invited people to receive Christ, about 30 or so people came forward.
Well, now, Bobby, let me ask you a question. Were you reluctant, a little bit fearful about that?
Oh, absolutely. Because I'm very emotional anyway.
I know that.
And so I don't know if God decides you will be so bad, I'm gonna make you a sissy on top of it. But he just, I felt like that's what I was called to do.
So you obeyed.
I obeyed.
And guess what? God bless that. How many times before that in that church has 30 people come forward for anything?
They never even brought that kind of message to the church.
We left.
But you know what? That's all right. You left your mark too. You know, and essentially, if I could challenge you to do anything, I would challenge you to trust God and follow him in obedience, regardless of how ridiculous he seems to be leading you. How ridiculous thing he wants you to do seems, because it might seem ridiculous to you, but God has a bigger plan. So essentially, Jonathan does that, and eventually he kills those 20. Word gets around, there's a bigger battle brewing. Saul finally hears all the noise of the battle. He jumps in, and he has to jump in, really. But before he does something. He calls for the ark. Now, why did he call for the ark? I mean, it seems spiritual, doesn't it? Let's get the ark. Let's be spiritual here. But it's actually Saul trying to look spiritual. 1 Samuel 14, verses 16 through 19.
Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, master the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand.
All right, so what's wrong with this picture here? What's wrong with this picture? Go get the ark. Is it time for the ark?
Like a weapon. It's not an honor of God, it's basically something.
Well, it was also actually turned into an idol, didn't it?
Mm.
But it wasn't time for the ark. It was time for war, right? And so what do you do when it's time for war? You get ready and you fight. It's not time to be spiritual. And Jonathan knew how to lead instinctively, but Saul didn't. Saul didn't know how to lead. He was actually clueless. but he was trying to make points because he had messed up a couple of times. And he was forced to join the battle, and God gave them the victory, but it wasn't because of Saul. Still, Saul managed to take credit for it. Yeah, he did. He absolutely took credit. But let me ask you, what do you think makes Jonathan a leader here? What do you think makes Jonathan a leader? Well, what?
His faith.
His faith makes him a leader. What else? I studied this and I found 7 things that make him a leader. So let me go through them real quick. First of all, first and foremost, the most important, he had belief and trust in God to help him and to empower him. That was essential. That was his first, I think, priority. And I think why God blessed him. He also had a bold and inspiring and shared vision. Okay, wasn't just his vision. I think essentially the armor bearer shared it. And despite the circumstances, okay, it was a shared vision and they went after it. He had what they call big, hairy, audacious goals. Big hags. Where'd that come from? Nobody knows where big, hairy, audacious goals. The guy from Standard who wrote the famous book. You know, huh? Huh? No, it's not good to great. It's big, hairy, audacious goals. His name's Collins, and he wrote, I can't remember the name of it.
I can't.
What? No, not Phil. But I can't remember the name of it now. But anyway, I'll think of it in a minute. Okay, but he had big goals, didn't he? They weren't little things. They were big things, and he had followers that he empowered and trusted, with whom he built a team. And eventually he did build a team beyond he and the armor bearer. And he had a willingness and a bias to act despite the discomfort. Okay, can you imagine him crawling up that craggly hill with thorns and sharp rocks? Yeah.
I mean, you got to think about what he did. He said in a half an acre. Okay,
Yeah.
that's 100 feet by 100 feet. You know, that's the size of most, well, some of us, by our yards where our houses are on.
Yeah.
2 guys against 20. There's nowhere to run and hide,
No, that's right.
you know?
By the way, Jim Collins wrote Good to Great. Big, hairy, audacious goals. But that's true. Go ahead, Alvin.
Hebrew actually said they did. Right. So they just went straight on up. As they came in, they just passed.
But like Glenn said, what kind of a climb was that? That's insane. See, we take that for granted. We read this stuff. Oh, that's nice. It wasn't nice, and yet they were up the top. They showed up. They followed God. And they believed him. He also had integrity and kept his commitments. And then finally, he had humility. He looked to God and gave God the glory for his victories. Those are essential parts of leadership. Go ahead.
And he took it. He had integrity, but he also took a responsibility for what he did. When he dipped his spear into the honey and took the honey, when Saul had said, nobody's to eat anything. When his father said, okay, you're the one that's responsible for God not answering, he said, all right, do to me what you must do.
Yeah, well, actually, that was a stupid rule anyway. We're going to get to that in a
I
little while.
know, but
Yeah. Well, so what happens next? And this is the second one. God attacks the Philistines. Saul joins the battle, and God gives him a great victory. Now Israel had less men, less technology, but that didn't matter. 1 Samuel 14, verse 15 and verse 20.
Verse 15, then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field and those in the outpost and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was panic sent by God. Verse 20, then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords.
So listen to this. God clearly provided all they needed, didn't he? And he doesn't always tell them how he's going to provide, but he provided everything they needed. He shook the ground. He sent them into panic. He turned the Philistines against each other, which I think is absolutely hilarious. And he used the forces of nature against them. Why? Because he controls the forces of nature. That's part of his sovereign control. And Jonathan showed up for battle, but God provided support in ways that Jonathan couldn't. Now, again, isn't that what God wants from us? He wants us to show up. He wants us to believe. He wants us to trust him. And he wants us to watch him work. And again, sometimes we show up, but only after we've calculated the odds of success. So let me ask you this, and it's a rhetorical question, but when was the last time you were called and didn't hesitate? When was the last time you just jumped in right away when God called you? Now that was Jonathan. He jumped into battle. And he did what God wanted him to do. Now I'm not saying here, again, we need to be irresponsible. We need to be responsible. But sometimes we're simply too calculated. We're simply relying on our own resources and not God's resources. We have plan A, B, C, A1, A2, A3. We have all kinds of alternatives, and we don't look to God. And when we do that, we miss his blessing. Bobby, when 30 people came forward, were you surprised?
Absolutely.
Were you blessed?
Yes. I had one guy tap me on the shoulder and said, thank
Amen.
you. He was a tear.
Well, once Jonathan's victory became known, Saul joined the battle. He had to do this. Why? His men see that the Philistines are melting away, so Saul assembles them. And then he calls for the ark, which is dumb, as I said. It's really feigned spirituality. It's time to fight. So Jonathan's fighting and Saul's being spiritual. But they go to war and they fight the Philistines, and they find the Philistines in disarray. 1 Samuel 14, 20 through 23.
Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines had gone up with them to their camp and went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven.
So what he's saying here is that some of the Israelites had been captured in earlier battles, and they had become Philistine slaves. And so when terror broke out and confusion broke out, they joined the battle in support of Israel, and they fought as well. So the Lord saved them, and the Lord gave them victory, and the battle shifts to Beth-aven. Okay, now what's interesting about it, what's so special about Beth-aven? Well, actually, if you take a look here on the map, you could see that Beth-aven is probably anywhere from, and I've read anywhere from 10 or 15 miles to as many as 20 miles north of Geba. So they moved north for the battle. Okay, now I'll come back to that in a minute, but what's happening here, and God still does this today. God still provides today. He used Jonathan, but if you think about it, Jonathan simply stepped up in bold faith and trusted God would provide. And on that step of faith, God surely moved miraculously. Now, God still does this today. Consider the 6 days war. Okay, what's the 6 days war about?
All kinds of enemies were coming against Israel.
Israel.
Egypt
okay.
and Jordan, and I can't remember who all. God was with it.
That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, Israel had less men, they were undermanned, and they had less technology. Arab forces were almost about 500,000 troops. And that's more than twice what Israel had. And also the Arabs had twice the number of tanks and four times the number of aircraft that Israel had. And yet God gave them a miraculous victory. As a matter of fact, Israel went in and totally destroyed Egypt's air force. Why is that? Do you remember how that happened? Well, they had a communication system between Jordan and Egypt and a bunch of all of the Arab countries. And guess what? Egypt had changed their software to be able to receive those messages. They didn't get the message. Jordan, when they took off, Jordan sent them a message. They didn't receive it, didn't get it. So the Israelite planes flew right in to Egypt and destroyed their air force. Okay. Yeah, God gave them those opportunities. And so he continues to do that. He continues to do that. Why don't we talk about that? Why don't we see God's hand in this stuff? Well, first of all, it doesn't appear in the media, does it? You know, the miraculous. And what happened, by the way, in the 6 Days War is that Israel gained more land. Okay. And of course, they've got a lot more to get. What? Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
they've got a lot more to get, though.
well, but at that time they got the Golan and now they say they're not giving it back either.
Well, there are lots of places that now Russia and Syria are challenging. But having said that, I don't want to get into that today. So let's look at finally, Saul invites resistance and he invites potential failure because of his stupid rule. 1 Samuel 14:24.
Now the men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food.
But it also says that the troops were distressed. Why is that? Why would that distress the troops? Huh? I read this. Alvin, can you read this? I got this on a military website. Now, what's interesting is that as I was reading some news, I came across this from the Sun. Okay, Russian troops are tired, hungry, deceived, and surrendering. Can you read that, Alvin? No, the Sun is the publication.
General, because he was so terrible.
Any of you read this in the mainstream media? But it's happening. It's happening. And again, this was a dumb mistake made by Saul, but also a dumb mistake evidently by Putin as well. Because his troops are starving, they're hungry, they're running out of supplies. Now, unknowingly, Jonathan breaks that order. 1 Samuel 14:24-27.
Now the men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be any man who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint."
So the troops are tired, they're hungry, and God gives them something to feed them and raise their morale. And now imagine the frustration when Saul gets in the way. Jonathan had heard about his father's order, and so he ate. It's a logical thing to do. And then one of the soldiers tells him and tells him about his father. And how does Jonathan react? 1 Samuel 14:29-30.
Jonathan said, my father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes are brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today. Some of the plunder they took from their enemies, would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?
So here he is, he states the obvious, doesn't he, Jonathan? Was it disloyal? Was he being disloyal?
No, he's being wise.
Well, he may have even been disloyal, but he was also correct.
He wasn't being disloyal because he didn't know anything about the command.
But Saul's reaction is saying that he is being disloyal. But even if he was, number one, he was correct. Number two, Saul had troubled the land. And because of that, the people, the soldiers were faint and less effective. And unfortunately, this led them to sin against God. What am I talking about here? Well, take a look at what happens next, and then we'll close up. 1 Samuel 14, 31, 32.
That day after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking the sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, did you want me to stop at 32?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Okay, that's it. Yeah, sorry.
So this is a direct violation. Why? What's it say in Deuteronomy 12, 23 through 25? Alvin, can you read that?
23. Go ahead.
Be sure you do not eat the blood, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. You must not eat the blood, pour it out on the ground like water. Do not eat it, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, because you will be doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord.
So think about this. On the occasion of God's blessing, on the occasion of God giving him victory, on the occasion of really celebrating their obedience to God, Saul prompted disobedience. How many of you remember real quickly the Baltimore Catechism? Okay, anybody remember the Baltimore Catechism? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, I do. That was what the Catholics said. But there's also the Westminster Larger Catechism. But all of these, the original Baltimore Catechism was written in 1885, had 421 questions and answers. Who made the world? God made the world. Who is God? God is the creator of heaven and earth and the supreme being of the universe. Why did God make me? God made me to know, love, and serve him in this world and be happy with him forever in heaven. Okay? And the Protestant version was written in 1643, and it has 196 questions and answers. So what's interesting about it here is one of the things that the nuns used to tell us, and those of you who didn't grow up in Catholic schools won't relate to this, but nuns used to tell us to avoid occasions for evil. Okay, anybody remember that? Remember that? Raise your hand if you remember that. Avoid occasions for evil. Okay. And it told us that the occasion for evil in the Catechism is defined as all persons, all places, and all things that may easily lead us into sin. And sin is defined as any willful thought, word, deed, or omission contrary to the law of God. Okay?
Nuns told us if we didn't have seatbelts back then, and everybody piled into the car to go somewhere, we thought we were gonna have to sit on a boy's lap. We were sure to take the phone with us.
That sounds familiar, actually. Well, what's interesting about this, let me just ask you a question. How do you think Saul feels about being an occasion for evil there? How does he respond to this? Instead of blaming himself and saying, I'm sorry, repenting, he's got a big ego here. And he finds himself blaming the people. 1 Samuel 14, 33 through 35.
Then someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this.
Take a look at some, what's he doing here? He says, you have dealt treacherously. Okay? In other words, he's blaming the people. And really Saul's a narcissist. Now, this is David Sikandikas. I think that's correct. It's Lithuanian. But he said here, people with strong narcissistic tendencies tend to blame others for their own bad behavior. It's always someone else's fault. They are unwilling or unable to reflect their own shortcomings and destructive behaviors. As a result, they project, blame, and manipulate others to cope with their low and shaky self-esteem. And that was Saul. He went from being humble and shy to narcissistic. And I think the power corrupted it. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And I told you about the CEO disease, where the question was, how do incredibly talented people who work very hard and demonstrate their integrity throughout their career, once they become CEOs, do incredibly stupid things? And it's a phenomenon that actually exists, and I think it's because of power. So then he set up a sacrifice to bless God, and that wasn't a bad thing to do, but he was way out of bounds already. Well, next week we'll come back and study more about Saul and Samuel and David. But for now, let's pray and